A childhood of poverty on an American farm. I was born in the fall of 1949, on a modest stretch of land not far from a little town in rural Nebraska. My earliest memories are tangled in the sweet and bitter scents of the earth. Fresh-turned soil in the spring, hay drying under the relentless sun, the dusty perfume of corn husks in the air. We lived in a battered farmhouse, paint peeling, with a tin roof that rattled in the prairie winds and wood floors that ached with every footstep. My family was large and love was plentiful, but luxuries were not. Mama and Daddy had 5 kids and I was the last, trailing behind my older siblings and always eager to prove I could pull my own weight. From as far back as I can remember, my life revolved around chores. At sunrise, I'd shuffle out to feed the chickens or gather eggs with my cold red hands, the grass soaked with dew, and my shoes leaving muddy imprints on the worn path. Summers were a parade of hard labor, my arms aching from hauling buckets of water, chasing runaway goats, helping Mama knead dough for bread, and swatting at the endless parade of flies that descended as soon as the weather warmed. School was a luxury carved out in the hours between chores and exhaustion. Our little schoolhouse was a mile walk through fields that shifted colors with the seasons, golden, then green, then brown. I loved to learn, but my attendance was spotty. When planting or harvest time came, my older brothers and sisters and I would miss weeks at a time. Our hands and backs needed more on the farm than in the classroom. I graduated from elementary school, but the idea of high school was a distant dream, weighed down by the cost of books, shoes, supplies, and the loss of 2 capable hands from the fields. We lived close to hunger more often than comfort. Meals were simple: cornbread, beans, potatoes, whatever we could coax from the stubborn earth or trade with neighbors. Mama made miracles out of scraps, a soup from ham bones, a pie from wild apples, and managed to stretch meals so no one went hungry on her watch, though sometimes my belly rumbled at night. There were times my oldest sister would split her own piece of pie and nudge the extra onto my plate when she thought I wasn't looking, but I always noticed, and tried to pay it back in small ways. Winters were especially hard. The wind would cut through the house no matter how we tried to stuff rags in the cracks of the windows. We heated only the kitchen with a wood stove, gathering around it in the evenings with numb fingers and even number soles, listening to Daddy tell stories or hum low tunes, while Mama mended cuffs and made lists of chores for the next day. But even in the struggle, there was a thread of hope and stubborn joy that ran through those years. Late at night, tucked into the bed in a tiny room shared with my sisters, I'd imagine the world beyond the next row of corn, a life where books and warm meals weren't treasures, but givens. Even now, remembering the lean years on that farm, I understand how they made me both tougher and more grateful. Growing up poor in rural America never lets you forget how precious comfort could be, or how little you needed really to survive. Leaving the countryside for the big city with nothing but determination. When I turned 20, there was a restless yearning in my bones that even the wide Nebraska sky couldn't quiet. I'd worked those fields since I could walk, but my dreams grew far beyond the endless rows of corn. The day I left home is still vivid in my memory. Mama pressed a worn Bible and 2 faded dollar bills into my palm, tears lining the creases of her face. Daddy clapped a rough hand on my shoulder, gave no speeches, only said, "Work honest and remember where you come from." I packed my few belongings in a battered suitcase, a pair of patched blue jeans, a handmade quilt, some family photographs, and Mama's cross-stitched handkerchief. My bus fare took nearly everything I had. When I first glimpsed Chicago's skyline, its steel and glass towers looked like alien mountains to a girl who'd known only the flat, open prairie. The city was a dizzying blur of noise, color, and people moving with purpose. I spent my first nights in a cramped boarding house on the south side, scared breathless by the clang of the L train outside my window, but determined not to run home defeated. Jobs for a farm girl were few. I started as a maid in a bustling Italian-American family's home. My days followed a grueling rhythm. Up before dawn, scrubbing floors, scouring greasy pots, tending laundry in the winter's biting cold. My hands quickly became raw and cracked, but every penny mattered. I learned the streets quickly, where not to walk at night, which corners hid friendly faces, which did not. There were days I missed the open air of Nebraska, and nights I cried silently, exhausted and homesick, but I never let myself falter for long. I sent most of my wages home, only keeping enough for sandwiches and bus fare. I was lonely, yes, but hunger and hardship had made me stubborn in my resolve. Little by little, the unfamiliar city began to feel less frightening. I started picking up English faster than I ever had back home. joking with local grocers, sharing coffee in the kitchen with other staff. Every Sunday I'd visit a little church not far from the house where I worked, praying for courage, for Mama's health, for a sign I was on the right track. Some nights I'd sit by my window and watch the city pulse below, so many lights burning, so many stories unfolding. I wondered what mine would become, and despite everything I held tightly to hope. Settling in the city was not the easy path, but I promised myself I'd carve out a place here, no matter how small, with my bare hands and the Nebraska grit my parents gave me. Pursuing a dream with a second-hand sewing machine. After nearly 3 years of relentless work and scraping by on wages barely enough to pay rent, an idea began to take root, a different kind of hope. The city, with all its glitter and glamour, had yet to hand me any breaks. But I had grown up watching my mother patch up pants and stitch together worn blankets, turning rags into treasures, and I realized those same hands could maybe make something more of themselves. Every Sunday I'd scour the classifieds in the Chicago Tribune looking for a way up. One chilly November morning I found it. A used Singer sewing machine, advertised by a retired seamstress in her 70s, who was selling off her tools before moving closer to her daughter. It was a clunky old thing, black, heavy as an anvil, with gold leaf filigree faded by decades of service. But to me, it looked like the key to a better life. I scraped together my tips, packed a mug of weak coffee, and made my way across miles of frozen sidewalk to her apartment. The old woman, smelling of lavender and mothballs, reminded me of my grandma. She showed me how the bobbin worked, how she'd mended wedding dresses and sailors' uniforms through World War II, and when I hesitated over the price, she squeezed my hand and said, "You look like you need a break. Promise me you'll use her well." With my new treasure in tow, I signed up for evening classes at a local community college. The sewing rooms were filled with women and a few men from all over, each with their own stories etched into their faces. Immigrants from Mexico, single mothers, retirees chasing dreams long deferred. My fingers, already seasoned from the farm and years of scrubbing, danced across the fabric. Learning dressmaking, tailoring, and alterations felt like breathing life back into the calluses on my hands. The first dress I made, a simple blue cotton number, was clumsy but a triumph. I wore it to Sunday service, proud and a little self-conscious, and received more compliments than I'd ever dreamed. Orders started to trickle in from the church ladies, hemming choir robes, mending uniforms. Soon a neighbor asked if I could make her daughter a graduation gown. Bit by bit, hope became skill, and skill opened doors to something like freedom. During those classes, I met Fred. He was the only man who showed up every week, a gentle soul with a slow smile and stories of his own hardscrabble roots in rural Tennessee. We commiserated late at night over vending machine coffee, sharing scraps of fabric and advice. That sewing machine, my battered second-hand hope, became the unlikely spark for a partnership. Fred and I started partnering on small projects, pooling our skills, supporting each other's ambitions to carve out something meaningful from all the struggle. Looking back, I still believe that heavy Singer machine was the turning point. It wasn't just a tool, it was proof that I could stitch together my own destiny, one careful seam at a time. The city would never be easy, but for the first time it felt like maybe there was a place for me in its swirling patchwork of lives. A small wedding, far from home. Our wedding, if you could even call it that by city standards, was barely more than a gathering in the cramped living room of the little apartment we'd managed to rent together. It was the spring I turned 25, a year that smelled like new beginnings made of equal parts hope and uncertainty. Fred and I had saved every extra penny, but still, there was no grand ceremony, no flowery invitations, no orchestra or tiered cake, just a handful of close friends from the neighborhood, a borrowed record player spinning crackling old ballads, and the smell of fresh bread I'd baked that morning to mask the apartment's lingering scent of heartache and bleach. We were determined to do things honestly, even if they were humble. Fred wore his one good suit. I sewed myself a dress from a length of pale blue cotton I found on clearance, embellishing the collar with little faded pearls from an old thrift store necklace. It may not have sparkled like the dresses in the bridal shops downtown, but it fit me like a memory. A simple, precious thing stitched with longing and resourcefulness. There was no veil, but I pinned a gardenia, bought from the corner florist's bucket, behind my ear. Looking in the mirror before the ceremony, I wondered if Mama would be proud, or if she'd weep out of worry because her youngest daughter was saying "I do" so far from Nebraska. The ceremony itself was swift and earnest. The justice of the peace, a kind-faced woman with a gentle, rasping voice, read words that felt heavier and sweeter than I'd expected. We exchanged rings that were, quite literally, modest bands fashioned from silver spoons by an old immigrant down the block, a secret known only to us and a few knowing smiles among our guests. When it was time for the vows, my hands trembled not from nerves, but from the meaning packed into words that finally felt like my own. Promises of loyalty, of trudging through both tough times and moments of grace together, no matter what lay ahead. Afterward, in the warmth of the tiny kitchen, we passed around paper plates heaped with homemade potato salad, fried chicken and cornbread, laughter echoing off the scratched linoleum floors. Someone brought a harmonica, another a battered guitar, and music filled the room, sometimes too loud, sometimes tender and low, but always just enough to fill the corners with comfort and possibility. We had nothing fancy, but we had each other, and somehow that seemed richer than the fanciest ballroom in all of Chicago. That night, after everyone had left, I found myself standing by the window, the city's glow folding around the silhouette of Fred and me in our borrowed happiness. Life, we knew, would be hard. Bills would come, seasons would turn, sorrow would collect quietly by the bedside as it always had. But in that moment, arms around each other, hope felt as tangible as the chill drifting in from the open window and the new gold glinting on my finger. In a city where so much was uncertain, our small, honest wedding anchored us to a future I had dared only to imagine. A life built from scratch, stitched together with laughter, sweat, and the relentless belief that love, indeed, could see us through. Nature's greatest gift, our firstborn son. Looking back, the years just after our humble little wedding simmer in my memory like a slow-cooked stew, simple, sometimes lean, but rich in love, and the wild energy of building a life from nothing. Even as we juggled 2 jobs, shared laughter and worry in equal measure over casseroles stretched a little too thin, and counted coins at the end of each month, a deeper hope quietly bloomed between Fred and me. When the news came that we were expecting a baby, it was as if the faded walls of our apartment lit up from within. I still remember standing in the small, sunlit kitchen one crisp morning, the taste of burnt toast on my tongue, my hands trembling as I held the doctor's note confirming the pregnancy. Fred pulled me into his arms, lifting me from the linoleum floor as a waltz from the radio filled the space, tears of disbelief and pure happiness streaming down my cheeks. For the first time since leaving Nebraska, my world felt like it was expanding. Pregnancy was both a blessing and a challenge. Our lives didn't pause just because we were having a child. I was still working at the seamstress shop, sewing late into the night to save for doctor's bills and setting aside a handful of small baby things, tiny socks, a second-hand mobile, a faded yellow blanket for the crib we'd yet to afford. Fred took on extra shifts as a bus driver, coming home exhausted, sweat-streaked in the long Chicago summers, but never failing to greet me with a smile and a gentle palm on my swelling belly. We spent months preparing, reading borrowed parenting books by the glow of an old lamp, fixing up every corner of our apartment, hoping to make it feel like a real home for our little one. I talked to my baby every evening, telling stories of the wind-blown cornfields of Nebraska, of honest work and simple pleasures, determined to pass on a sense of roots, even if our home was just a tiny slice of city sky. The night Jack was born, a thunderstorm rolled through the city, rattling window panes and shaking loose the memories of my own childhood fears. After hours of labor, just as the rain eased, the doctor placed a plump, red-faced baby boy into my arms. A hush full of awe and gratitude settled over me. All the hunger, hard work, hope, and heartbreak of my youth seemed to have led to this moment. A perfect squirming miracle with Fred's dark hair and my stubborn chin. I found myself weeping again, whispering prayers of thanks, Fred at my side, his hands shaking as he first traced Jack's tiny fingers. Raising Jack was everything, both heart-bursting joy and exhaustion. We learned quickly the rhythms of sleepless nights and diaper changes, singing lullabies taught by my own mother, improvising silly songs when Jack fussed. Each milestone, a first smile, first step, babbled "Mama," felt like some holy event. Even when money was tight, we celebrated Jack's little victories. A birthday party with store-brand cake, hand-sewn birthday hats, picture books borrowed from the library. I never grew tired of watching Fred scoop Jack up and dance around our little living room, their laughter chasing away any of the city's cold edges. Jack's arrival brought meaning to every sacrifice, redefining what comfort and success meant to us. We did not have much, but with our baby boy in our arms, every hope for the future felt suddenly within reach, as if we had been given back, in one small body, all the possibility the world could offer. Jack truly was, and always will be, the greatest gift nature and fate conspired to grant two dreamers far from home. The ups and downs of family happiness. Family life, despite the storms life threw our way, was an ever-changing landscape. Sometimes lush with happiness, sometimes stripped bare by loss. Those years after Jack's birth remained bittersweet, marked by Sunday picnics on patches of grass outside church, handwritten birthday cards, and quiet evenings gathered around the supper table, laughing at silly stories. There was never much extra. Our vacations were afternoon outings to the city park, our celebrations a homemade cake and the good plates dusted off from the top shelf. Still, there was so much warmth inside those humble walls that for a while, I almost believed hardship was behind us. With Fred by my side, it always felt like we could weather anything. He'd come home from long shifts behind the wheel of his bus and scoop Jack up in his arms, spinning him around the living room until their laughter nearly shook the old windows loose. I found a rhythm in my work too, sewing for neighbors, stitching prom dresses and hemming uniforms, a word-of-mouth business that, little by little, made ends meet. At night, when Jack was asleep, Fred and I would sit under the flickering kitchen light dreaming aloud of better tomorrows, college for Jack, maybe a little house with a porch, the chance to visit family back home someday. But life, as I'd learned, cares little for human plans. One pale winter afternoon, everything changed. Fred never made it home from work. Word came in stuttering waves. A crash, a stormy intersection, a phone call from the hospital. The world shrank to the cold linoleum floor of the ER waiting room and the ringing in my ears as a doctor shook his head. There was no time to bargain or prepare, just grief, a physical ache, raw and hungry that rooted in my chest and refused to let go. Those first months after losing Fred were a blur of waking up at dawn with swollen eyes, guiding Jack through his hurt, and gritting my teeth through jobs I'd never imagined doing. Bills arrived relentlessly, and the apartment walls pressed in closer than ever. Sometimes at night, I'd find myself talking aloud to Fred as if he might still hear, asking how to get through this alone, how not to let Jack see the cracks running through me. But even as the world felt merciless, tiny gestures kept hope alive. A neighbor dropping off soup, the church bringing over bags of groceries, a classmate of Jack's sharing a worn-out baseball glove. These gifts, given with no expectation, reminded me that, in the wild thicket of sorrow, kindness could still bloom. I clung to the memory of our happier days and pushed forward, if not for myself, then for my son. Family was not just blood, it was the patchwork of support, love and resilience, pieced together in the face of every storm. Between suffering and flickering hope. Between the tides of grief and moments where hope flickered, life for my son and me changed in every way. After Fred's death, each morning felt thick as honey, hard to push through, and every room in our little apartment echoed with absences. The payout from Fred's modest life insurance and the scraps of our savings kept us fed, and with a roof over our heads for a short while. I clung to penny-pinching habits, stretching meals, repairing the same worn shoes for Jack, trying so hard to protect my son's small world from the devastation that had shaken mine. I'd always been cautious, but loss makes you desperate. When a well-dressed man knocked on my door, speaking gently and promising to turn my last dollars into more, I wanted so badly to believe him. He showed papers stamped with seals, talked about investment, about helping widows get on their feet. My heart leapt at his kind words and faltered when the last of our money left my hands. Weeks passed, letters went unanswered, his phone always rang out. I realized too late I'd been fooled. The money Fred and I had scraped together meant for Jack's future and our security was gone. In those darkest days I took any job I could. Some mornings I'd clean cheap motel rooms, scrubbing stains and changing sheets while my mind replayed every past mistake. In other places I washed laundry until my knuckles were raw, sweeping the corridors and swallowing the lump in my throat as I heard richer visitors complaining about towels or noise. Sometimes I'd find myself in a public restroom at dusk, mopping floors and blinking back tears, wondering if I'd ever pull myself out again. Jack was my reason not to collapse under the weight of it all. Every night I told myself that no matter how defeated I felt, I had to shield him from the full force of our troubles. Even when his young eyes watched me too closely, sensing more than he ever said, I forced a smile, helped with his homework, pretended our supper of soup and stale bread was a feast. When he asked about Fred, I told stories of his father's laughter, his warmth, a way to keep hope alive in both of us. The world outside our apartment did not offer much mercy. Bills piled up, and each day felt like an endurance test. Occasionally a neighbor would send over a casserole or hand-me-downs for Jack, acts of kindness that cut through the bleakness. A local pastor dropped off groceries once when he heard of our troubles, and that small act almost undid me. I sat in the kitchen afterward, pressed my hand to my chest, and simply let myself cry from relief. Yet, even as I seemed to lose piece after piece of my old life, savings, certainty, security, some stubborn ember inside refused to die out completely. Maybe it was faith, maybe pure habit, or maybe just the memory of Fred urging me to keep going no matter what. I would fall asleep at night making silent bargains with God or fate. Just give me one more chance, one more day where things didn't collapse, and I would keep pushing on. These fleeting sparks of hope, though faint, were enough to carry me from one hard day to the next, lighting a path ahead even if only a few feet at a time. Single parenting and the pain not meant for the weak-hearted raising. Jack alone was a trial that tested the limits of my strength and resolve every single day. Without Fred by my side, every aspect of parenthood, once shared, now shouldered solely by me, felt heavier, shadowed by a particular loneliness known only to single parents. There were nights when the ache in my chest was as sharp as the one in my back after a long shift, yet I never allowed Jack to see me falter. Providing for his needs was an unending tightrope walk. I juggled 2, sometimes 3 jobs. I cleaned offices before dawn, fitted alterations at a dry cleaner in the afternoons, and after dinner I'd take in sewing for extra cash, patching jeans, hemming dresses, or making Halloween costumes for neighborhood kids. Money was always tight, but hunger and true hardship never crossed our door, as long as I kept moving. The food was simple. Lots of stews, bread, and whatever produce was on sale. But I made mealtimes warm, a small haven of stability for Jack. School was my biggest worry. I remembered too well my own patchy education out on the farm, how being needed for chores and unable to afford proper supplies had stunted my dreams. I was determined Jack would not suffer the same fate. I scrimped for his school fees, for second-hand uniforms, for pencils and notebooks. I made a point to volunteer at PTA meetings, half out of genuine concern, half to keep an eye on how others treated him. Sometimes he came home quiet, reluctant to meet my eyes, and I knew without asking that the other kids teased him for having no fancy brand-name shoes or the latest gadgets. Every time that happened, a twist of guilt tightened inside me. Still, I tried to fill that gap with everything I could. I encouraged him to bring home friends, even when I had only popcorn to serve. Holidays were makeshift but always special. A Christmas tree made of painted cardboard, hand-sewn stockings, a pie baked from apples bruised and discounted. Jack's laughter when it came, bright and full, was my greatest reward. But there were also rough patches, times when my exhaustion bubbled over into impatience, when my own bitterness slipped into my voice. I'd apologize, hugging him close, reminding myself I was all he had left. Some nights after Jack fell asleep, I'd sit at the kitchen table and weep from pure fatigue and fear. How long could I play the magician, keeping the world's worst away and hope alive? Yet every morning I started again. I learned to be my own comforter, to draw strength from within when there was no hand to hold but my own. Over the years I saw a quiet resilience harden in Jack, a stubborn spark in his eyes that sometimes reminded me of Fred, and sometimes of a much younger, braver version of myself. I clung to the hope that, for all the pain, I was giving him what really mattered, roots to anchor him, and courage to face a world that did little to spare the weak. Feeling lonely in old age, my child turns away. As the years wore on and the seasons cycled through the windows of my modest apartment, a different kind of ache began to settle in. A loneliness that pressed in most acutely with the arrival of old age. Time had slipped by so stealthily. Days spent nurturing Jack through childhood and adolescence, nights spent sewing to keep the lights on, all seemed wrapped in a sepia haze now, as if they'd happened to another woman. Jack had always been a quiet, affectionate boy, sometimes withdrawn but rarely rebellious. I poured my pride and every last penny into making sure he had what he needed, a decent education, shoes that fit in with his classmates, a set of second-hand textbooks that, to us, might as well have been bound in gold. When he got accepted to college in Boston, I skipped meals to send him enough for rent, stretched my savings embarrassingly thin to wire money for registration fees each semester. My heart swelled with the belief that sacrificing comfort now would guarantee joy in the years ahead, his and by proxy, my own. But adulthood, I learned, can have a way of pulling even the closest families apart. Boston was far, and so was the world Jack found there, one filled with polished ambition, new friends, and increasing distance from the stubborn, practical love of a mother left behind. Our conversations grew shorter, sometimes taut with misunderstanding or long silences. When he struggled to find a job after graduation, I did all I could. Drafted resumes, made calls, even sent care packages stuffed with homemade bread and reminders of home. Eventually, Jack called with a request that made my heart both soar with hope and twist with worry. He wanted a place of his own, a clean start, maybe an apartment to finally anchor his new life. I didn't hesitate, even when I knew the risk. I mortgaged what little I'd managed to save over decades, borrowed heavily from the bank, sold the last pieces of heirloom jewelry, all to put Jack in a modest apartment. His gratitude was tepid, distracted, but I told myself it was only the stress of youth. When he got married, I waited for an invitation to join him, to become, if not the heart of a new family, at least welcome within its circle. Instead, my phone sat silent. Eventually I realized seeing me, hearing me, became less of a joy and more of a burden for him. Each visit seemed perfunctory, every phone call short and businesslike. The only time he came by was when he needed help paying a bill, or when some bureaucratic hassle required a mother's signature. I would overhear his wife's voice in the background, cold, curt, and the ache of exclusion grew sharper. My longing for connection became a quiet humiliation. Unanswered letters, missed birthdays, holidays spent staring at the phone, praying for a call that rarely came. Growing old in a new country is a peculiar kind of solitude, especially when the child you raised turns away. The world I knew, neighbors moving on, friends grown frail or gone, contracted down to just the hush of my apartment and memories that replayed themselves in loops each night. I would wander from room to room clutching old family photos, the silence heavier than any argument, and wonder if love had not simply been misplaced, but rendered invisible in the unforgiving calculus of adulthood. Yet, I did not resent Jack. I had made choices, given freely, and loved without condition. But there was no denying the sting of being left behind, of realizing that the last chapter of a hard-lived life might be spent not in celebration, but in quiet, aching solitude. The abyss, disease, fraud, and loneliness. After years spent weathering storms both big and small, encountering the abyss in old age was something no one could ever truly prepare for. At this point in life, my bones ached with a cold that no amount of blankets could truly dispel, and the world outside my little window seemed to move on without me. Loneliness was no longer simply a visitor. It had taken up permanent residence in my home. The shadows grew longer as my health began to falter. Arthritis crept into my joints, turning everyday tasks, pouring a glass of water, buttoning a blouse, into lessons in patience and humility. Simple colds seemed to linger for weeks, morphing into chest infections, and each trip to the doctor carried the shadow of bills I no longer knew how to cover. My body felt less like an ally and more like a stubborn piece of machinery rusting away. Amidst this physical decline there was the sharp, unseen pain of betrayal. One cold afternoon the phone rang. It was a voice I yearned for, trembling with urgency. "Mom, it's me, I need help, I'm in trouble, please just wire what you can." The longing to be needed, to matter, was so overwhelming that reason drowned beneath a tide of heartache. I sent everything I had, my last savings, the money tucked away for medicine, even what I might have spent on groceries, only to discover it was a cruel trick, a stranger mimicking my son's desperation to prey on the frail hope of an old woman. The aftermath shattered me. I found myself spiraling lower than I had ever imagined possible. Hospital visits blurred together with nights spent counting coins for medication, pawning keepsakes and praying the pain in my chest was just heartache and not something fatal. Friends I once called on had either passed on or faded away. The phone no longer rang, letters went unanswered, my mailbox filled only with bills and advertisements. Sometimes I would pace the small living room, clutching a pillow to my chest, fighting the urge to call Jack, not to scold, just to ask for the simplest comfort, a voice, a reassurance, anything to let me believe the world had not closed its doors entirely. Yet each attempt was met with indifference or silence. My longing for connection turned into something raw and embarrassing, so I learned to swallow it day after day, and let hope recede graciously into the background. Isolation can carve you hollow, but worse was the realization that trust, once broken in such a cruel fashion, stained every interaction. I became wary, shrinking from neighbors' invitations, keeping my pain and my poverty behind closed curtains. Even the sunniest mornings felt tinged with gray, and nights stretched long and fearsome, punctuated by the sharp ache of regret and the weight of emptiness. In this new landscape of frailty, I understood finally what it meant to be truly alone, a kind of suffering reserved for those who have loved fiercely and lost it all. Still, though tears would come in quiet waves, I made a silent promise to myself to keep going, even if my days were counted only by the rhythm of breath and the shuffle of slippers on a cold kitchen floor. The Miracle and the Mysterious Lawyer. A miracle rarely arrives with fanfare, and in my case it wore the unlikely disguise of a cold, drizzling Tuesday afternoon. My strength was just about spent after months of living on little more than black coffee and hope. I had shuffled out that day to a discount store to stretch my last dollars, all too aware that each step was slower and each breath a little harder than it used to be. Crossing the parking lot, I barely noticed the sleek silver sedan maneuvering carefully through the puddles, until with a thud and a startled gasp the world went askew and I landed harshly against the damp blacktop. A rush of apologies followed. A tall man, perhaps in his late 50s, rushed out, his umbrella snapping open as he knelt beside me. His suit was much too fine and pressed for our drab neighborhood, and the expression in his eyes as he helped me up was one of genuine concern, not just bureaucratic fear. He offered to drive me to the hospital, and when I told him about my reluctance, too expensive, no insurance, he hesitated just a moment before insisting, "Let me handle it, please. At least let me make sure you're not badly hurt." That single act of kindness triggered a string of unlikely events. In the hospital waiting room as he waited by my side, he learned more about my situation than I ever expected to share with a stranger. There was something about his measure of patience, a silence that invited honesty, and before long I found myself describing years of struggle, the son who deserted me, the home that I'd lost through legal trickery and heartbreak, my existence on the outskirts of comfort and dignity. Instead of pity or discomfort, he listened with the calm focus of someone used to bearing weighty problems for others. He introduced himself simply as Charles, an attorney specializing in elder law and tenant rights. It turned out he frequented that shopping center only occasionally, running errands for his wife's volunteer work. Fate, it seemed, had played matchmaker in the bleakest chapter of my life. After ensuring I was safely home, Charles returned the next day, armed with a briefcase and a quiet determination. He reviewed my papers, foreclosure notices, letters from my son's agents, the tangled mess of documentation I had been unable to decipher. "Your rights were violated," he concluded, voice steady and warm. "Would you let me help you fight this?" It was the first offer of real support I'd received in years, and though I felt suspicion stir, after all I'd endured, who would not, there was a kindness that I couldn't deny. What followed was months of paperwork, hearings, and cautious hope. Charles never once suggested fees, never lost patience with my questions or my tears when the process felt too daunting. He found loopholes missed by others, rallied community groups to advocate on my behalf, and even tracked down records that proved the transfer of my home had been based on deception and unfair pressure. Every update from him felt like a ray of sunlight. For the first time in years I saw the legal system as something that could, perhaps, shield the vulnerable, not just punish or ignore them. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown, just a quietly delivered letter from the court reversing the fraudulent deed, affirming my right to regain my home. I wept when Charles handed me copies of the judgment, hands trembling as relief and gratitude mingled. He told me simply, "You deserve dignity, not just survival." And in that moment I believed him. Charles never sought thanks or accolades. We met every so often afterward for coffee, gradually becoming unlikely friends, bound by a shared belief that a single act of kindness can tip the scales of a life hanging in the balance. The miracle, I realized, wasn't only the recovery of my home, but the restoration of my faith, in neighbors, in the possibility of good surfacing from the unlikeliest places, and in my own right to hope, even at the edge of despair. Living peacefully in the twilight years. As I settled into the quiet rhythms of my later years, life finally surrendered to a gentle, forgiving pace. Gone was the anxious thrum that had haunted so much of my adulthood, the endless calculations, tightening my belt against misfortune and grieving what was lost. After all the storms and heartbreak, somehow peace landed softly, unexpected as a spring morning after a brutal winter. My new home in Oregon was nothing like the bustling city apartments or noisy neighborhoods I'd clung to for decades. The house itself was humble, nestled at the edge of a small town, with a neat patch of yard that backed onto tangled woods. Out front, there was a creaky porch swing, and in the back, rows of tomatoes and beans I tended as the seasons came and went. Grounding my hands in the dirt brought a calm I'd never known before. Every seedling felt like a tiny promise that life could begin again, no matter the losses in its wake. Neighbors here were kind, but never intrusive. Many were older folk like me, their stories tucked away behind gentle eyes and weathered hands. They offered help after the first frost, invited me for tea or church picnics, and respected when I needed my solitude. I discovered a quiet camaraderie in exchanging vegetables over fences or swapping recipes for zucchini bread, something sweet and sturdy that seemed to grow as abundantly as the friendships did. Days slipped by in simple rituals. Each morning I'd brew weak coffee and take it onto the porch, watching the mist slip between the firs as birds announced another sunrise. Sometimes I would write letters, though not always send them to Jack, stories of the garden or memories he'd laughed at as a boy. My heart ached for him, but bitterness had long since drained away. Love, I discovered, could coexist with absence, its roots burrowed deeper by longing and hope. Every so often Charles, my lawyer-turned-friend, would stop by during his travels. He always insisted I deserved grace and gratitude in these twilight years, and in these fleeting visits I found encouragement to live with dignity and softness. I learned, at last, to tend to myself as patiently as I once cared for my family. I cooked simple meals, painted small watercolors for no one but myself, sang along to old records that remembered for me when memory sometimes slipped. Community wasn't the clamorous gatherings of youth, but a tapestry of small daily kindnesses, a casserole left at my door, a hand steadying me on icy steps, a neighbor calling my name from across the street. If loneliness tugged at me, I let it settle like dust, gentle, not suffocating, just a reminder of all that I had loved well and lost. Some evenings under a harvest moon, I'd imagine Jack walking up the garden path, and in those moments, forgiveness bloomed brighter than regret. Oregon's rain washed clean old hurts, and I found finally peace not as a gift from someone else, but as a small victory I claimed each day. I've come to believe that gratitude, the deep, wordless kind found in tending tomatoes or hearing a friend's laughter, could heal wounds that time alone could not. I face each sunrise with a steady hope, and should Jack ever return, my arms will always open, wide as the Oregon horizon, waiting for the chance to love without condition, just as I always have. In this quiet corner of the world, I am content, surrounded by kindness, memory, and the hard-won joy of simply enduring.